Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrea Olive, and I'm the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and I would like to welcome you to our 2022 Public Affairs Lecture. I'm going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. As many of you know, acknowledging the land is an Indigenous protocol used to express gratitude. I think on a day when we're going to discuss a topic like war, it is especially important to pause and reflect on our relationship to land. On Turtle Island, to recognize the land is an expression of appreciation to those whose territory you reside on. It's a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long-standing history that brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto, Mississauga operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is my pleasure to welcome our guest, as well as the moderator for today's discussion. Terell Starr is an independent journalist covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He's been living part-time in Ukraine since 2016. He first lived and studied there as a Fulbright scholar. He's also lived in the nation of Georgia, where he volunteered for the Peace Corps. He's fluent in Russian and has a master's degree in Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies, and a master's degree in journalism from the University of Illinois. He has 15 years of journalism experience. He's the host of the Black Diplomats podcast, where he covers geopolitical issues. He recently completed his memoir on how his upbringing informed his understanding of US-Russian foreign policy and the intersections between American white supremacy and imperialism. He regularly appears on news networks around the world where he provides first-person reporting from Ukraine. I would also like to introduce the moderator for today, Ed Schatz, who is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. His research interest is primarily in identity politics, social transformations, social movements, anti-Americanism, and authoritarianism, with a focus on the ex-USSR. He recently published Slow Americanism, Anti-Americanism, Social Movements, and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia. So before turning the mic over, I would just like to note that everyone should keep their microphones off for the duration of the event. You can ask questions in the chat and we will get to those shortly, but we're going to begin today by inviting our guests to take the first 15 to 20 minutes for opening remarks before we move to discussion. I will turn it over to you now, Terell.
Okay, so thank you all very much. I want to thank the organizers, the Political Science Department, University of Toronto, for making this event possible, reaching out to me. It's always an honor anytime someone says that we would like for you to speak to us and impart your knowledge about any given subject. People like myself, we devote a lot of time, and our natural time. I'm in Ukraine right now. I'm in Kyiv at this very moment. I'm looking out my window, and so people who love this work, we devote our time to it. And anytime someone asks us to speak, it's an honor. And I thank you all for taking time out of your very busy schedules to listen to me speak. And also, particularly to your students, thank you. I know that you all care very much about this subject, which is why you're here. And so I look forward to speaking with you after my remarks and answering any questions that you have. There's no such thing as a dumb question. You could talk to me about pretty much my work, how I view this country, etc. So again, thank you for that. So in the introduction, in the opening remarks, the language colonialism and land was used a lot. And when we think about colonialism, that's something that often people in mainstream media especially do not associate with the countries that were under the USSR, under the Russian Empire. Often when we think about colonialism, it's something that white Europeans do to non-white people. We often hear colonialism in the framework of Africa. We often hear colonialism, at least with enlightened minds and those who know better in the mindset of America, when we think about the indigenous communities there. And then also, of course, with the country of let me see here, of course, with the country of Canada. And so it's very important that we recognize colonialism, not only from people who we consider to be the bad guys, but also recognizing the colonialism in Western nations that that Ukraine is seeking help from, which is the really ironic aspect of colonization here. But I'll get more into that. So I have been in Ukraine since well before the beginning of the war. I'm an independent journalist. My last job was as the national political correspondent at The Root, which at the time was the largest Black media outlet, not anymore, but at one point it was the top news site for Black America. And I covered domestic politics there while I was covering Ukraine and Eastern Europe part-time, essentially. But I've been here since before the war in early January. And I divide my time between Central Asia and here in Brooklyn. And I was here for two reasons, interestingly enough, to start a tourism business, which that's obviously not going to happen at the moment. And in addition to starting a tourism business, well, I'm going to start that in next summer. Hoping that this war will be done, I will start a tourism business. And so I also came here to start a clothing resale business, and I'll pull up the photos once we get into the Q&A. But at any rate, when I came here, I did not expect to be covering a war. This is the first time that I am in a war, and this is the first time that I have done any war correspondence. And the attitude here in Ukraine was that while the Kremlin was menacing and it was threatening, the most that many people here in Kyiv thought would happen, or Ukraine thought would happen, is that the Kremlin, Russia, would take over the majorities, the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk, and go to the and go further east into Kharkiv, but not beyond that. On the first night, we experienced bombings everywhere, and I don't know for any of you who have been to Ukraine or have ever lived through a war zone environment. The first night, I was in my apartment in downtown Kyiv. You hear explosions, and it takes you, and each person who deals with a war, you go through a psychological adjustment. And what that psychological adjustment is, it's different for everyone. So for me, it was the sirens of the air-to-ground missile strikes. You also, warning you to go to shelter. You also have the explosions in the background that are jarring and are terrifying, but you get used to them after a while, if you can believe such a thing. And so there are literally moments where people are walking through the streets here and you hear explosions about 10 to 15 clicks away. And I keep saying clicks, kilometers away. And you just know that it's fighting, in the distance. And you just kind of go and say, okay, it's not going to reach me, even though I have covered several instances here in Ukraine, here in Kyiv, where where airstrikes not only hit residential areas, but I missed a missile strike during my own reporting by roughly 200 meters. And I literally saw air to ground strikes hit a military base. And I was there to cover the aftermath of that. And I think for those of you who follow me on Twitter, you saw that. So the thing about war here, and particularly how it is covered, is that you're dealing with a person in Putin who in 1 week turned from an authoritarian leader to a totalitarian one. And because you're all in political science, you're all keenly aware of the differences of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And the totalitarian aspects of it came whereby where travel was restricted and liberties of speech were further restricted. And as many of you know, authoritarianism does allow for travel. When we think about pure totalitarianism, you think about Kim Jong-un in North Korea, right? And while Russia has not reached that point, not nearly as much, what is happening in Russia as a result of this war, and basically in order to keep the lies going so that people even internally are not allowed to speak against the truth and about what's happening in Ukraine from a media standpoint. And that's also social media, Facebook, Twitter, all those are banned. It's really designed to shut off any dissent whatsoever. In Ukraine, what is happening is that the country is very much militarized. There are checkpoints, every 10 minutes, depending on where you're going, every 10 minutes or so. There are areas in the country where you cannot go. It's created a refugee crisis that is really something that's really heartbreaking to see. In addition to my work, and so for example, you have tens of thousands, well, hundreds of thousands of people, women and children mainly, who are leaving the country. As I'm looking at nighttime, for example, as I look out my window, usually this neighborhood, Ukraine is a country of, Kyiv is a city the size of Chicago, more than 3 million people, and large high rises. In my neighborhood, you see all these high rises in at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night. The windows are just lit. Everybody's in their living room doing what they're doing. Now everything is completely dark. In fact, I'm one of the few people that's in this apartment building right now, and because everyone has left the country, literally. I mean, millions of people have left the country, and many of them have come from Kyiv. And ironically, people thought that Kyiv would be the least safe place to be. What we are learning is that Kyiv, even though it's being hit with bombs, is that because of the air defense system, it's one of the most protected cities for obvious reasons, strategically. And it is the villages around, many of the villages around Kyiv, where people fled to, ironically, for safety, is where they're being hit. So as a journalist, you have Putin, who is clearly the bad guy, the totalitarian, who is menacing not only Ukraine, but his own people. But you're dealing with a totalitarian leader who is actually losing a war, right? I mean, because what you all don't see in the media and what we get, and if you follow Ukrainian Telegram, for example, is that for all the lack of B-roll that you're seeing of the Ukrainian army fighting, plenty of it is on social media, and the Ukrainians are kicking Russia's ground forces' butts. And it's so bad that the bodies are literally on the ground and people haven't moved them because the Russians are fleeing and not picking them up. And so those are the real situations that are happening here. And so as a journalist, and I'll tell you about my role. How do I cover this? What is my responsibility to you all, to the world, about what's happening here? And as a journalist, my job, there are two things. One, I'm an independent journalist. Two, I am not someone who considers himself to be a mainstream type of person. And so I write from a very opinionated perspective, because I came to Ukraine not as a journalist who is quote unquote objective. I don't believe in objectivity, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but I believe in fairness. But my role is that this place is personal to me. I spend half of my time of my year in Ukraine. And so it's a home for me. And so the role that I take is that of really explain to people what imperialism looks like. And one of the main threads there is in my journalism is that I challenge the ways in which Westerners in particular think about imperialism, while at the same time challenging the imperialistic nature of our own political structures, which is something that is really challenging for a lot of people to chew on, right? So in one right, when I explain Ukraine, again, and I came from a Black media background, and many people who have followed me, people on social media, namely my Twitter, don't understand what's happening. They literally look at this as, why are these white people fighting each other? That's how they look at it. It's a bunch of white people, because in the American context particularly, they are. What I have to explain to them is that outside of the American context, in the Eastern European context, they aren't. And in fact, the large portions of the Eastern Europeans in the Western European framework are viewed upon as kind of lower whites or white trash, to be quite frank with you. And that is the perception of them. And so when I am here as a Black person in Ukraine, I clearly see that. And so I try to draw parallels that are not necessarily exact, but they are parallels. And it draws us to understanding the context in which they should look at it, because otherwise they won't be able to, be able to catch on. And why is that important? Because you can't really have an emotional empathy for a country that you don't understand, and whose culture and whose context has very little to do with yours. And so I talk about Ukraine from the perspective of not only colonialism, but also through Putin's racism. And so if you list, there are several things, and I want you all to pay attention to this. And I'll talk about another 5 minutes. I hope that's okay, because I now do the Q&A. But basically, with Putin, if you listen to his speech leading up to this war, there was the way that he spoke about Ukrainians, in my view, very much is how racist white supremacists speak about Black people. And he talks about this brotherhood. People use fascism and all these things, and all those apply. But also, because ultimately in Putin's eyes, he doesn't disparage them in the sense that, oh, you Ukrainians are another people. He just says, you're not Ukrainian at all. You're Russians. You're part of us, right? He says that. But I bring up racism because the worst thing that you can do is take away a person's agency. And in Putin's eyes, you have none. They have none. Also, the way that he talked about Crimean Tatars, he referred to Crimean Tatars as Islamic terrorists. I mean, and again, that was not something that was covered in Western press. Why? Because the way, if any American, or I would assume a Canadian elected official, were to use that type of language, we'd be talking about Islamophobia, we're talking about racism. So there is racism in Putin's language in the way that he talks about this country. That is evidently clear. And so I bring up these frameworks because oftentimes when you have people who are studying Russia and Eastern Europe, one, is not very diverse. It's mostly white people, white men. And to understand Russia, you can't just understand politics and military and language. You have to understand culture. You have to understand in various forms. You have to understand colonialism. You have to understand how ethnicity works. And you have to have an intellectual depth that will allow you to explore how people can be racialized. And that's something that Putin does with Ukrainians within this own kind of Russian, in this own type of, kind of Russian framework. And so what I have been able to do with my journalism is I've been able to expand the audiences of people who have a desire to participate in the conversation. Once I establish a framework or a kind of like a tunnel through which people can come to this conversation, then we can introduce to them the fascism and all these other things that they get, that we all know as area studies specialists. What I also do is, and also I cover military a lot, but what I'm doing now, moving forward, is I'm also talking about how Africans are treated here. That's another dichotomy that people really are not discussing in the depths that I think they are discussing it, and we are discussing it, but you're covering a country that is dealing with that's being extremely abused, that's being bombed, that's being attacked, where as far as I'm concerned, war crimes are taking place. But then you have this other factor where you have Africans who are trying to flee this conflict, Africans who have a long history of coming to Ukraine and Russia to study, that are being mistreated at the Ukrainian border. And then in many instances, you have dozens of people who are being detained once they get into Poland, for example. And so how do I, as a journalist, also a Black American, and I say Black American because I think it's, even though I'm a Black person, and you look at me, I could be anything, but the reality of it is that there are elements of, I would call passport privilege that I carry. And so quite frankly, I'm not going to experience a lot of the same things that my fellow African brothers and sisters are going to experience at the border, primarily because I whip out my passport and people react to me very differently. I think it's disgraceful, it's a shame, but it's something that's happening. I'm more than willing to talk to you about it. And I'll close out with this one example of this, is that I'm doing a lot of humanitarian work, and that work includes trying to medevac a Cameroonian person who's disabled. And we're trying to get him a medevac out of the country. So in addition to my journalism, I'm doing this kind of humanitarian stuff on the side. But I went to I was escorting a Ukrainian family, to the border, to the Slovak border. And I'm communicating with a guy named Shane, who's waiting on the other side, British guy. The family I'm escorting, I'm giving you the abridged version. They were in a bomb shelter for 3 days. They came out, were terrified. We take them, across the country, and it took 2.5 days on a trip that normally would take about 12 or 15 hours. It took us 2.5 days. We get to the border, I'm in the line, there's the Ukrainian line, there's the other, the quote unquote foreigner line, which are Black and brown people who look like me. I'm with this Ukrainian family in the Ukrainian line, and the border person who was actually quite rude, right? To everybody, but he made really, I think, insensitive remarks about, African people. He, asked about me, and I'm like, I'm escorting this family. They say, okay. And so basically, the family, I'm with them the whole time. They follow us around like ducks. Terell, don't leave us, don't leave us, don't leave us. No problem. I didn't. I escorted them across the border. What's interesting enough about this is that because of my passport, I can come and go. And, nobody's going to look at me and ask for my documents and all these other things. And again, it shouldn't matter because everybody's a refugee and the goal is to get people out. But anyway, just saying that it's a fact. I go across the border. I hand this family over to Shane, who is a Black British man. The moral to this story, and he's working for an aid organization. The moral to this story is that, one of the unfortunate elements of this and the things that I talk about is how this refugee crisis has brought up inequity and how we view one refugee over the other. And that the people who helped to take this family to safety were 2 Black men who come from countries that were colonized by the very people from which Ukraine is seeking help. That is the irony of all of this. And finally is that but also one of the things that I'm doing here is really talking about once this war ends, because it will end, what does it mean for this world to live in a society where you don't have these hegemonic hierarchies, which is really the genesis of this problem, right? These political hierarchies. And because ultimately you have Russia, you have America, and you have a situation by where, in this instance, America is the good guy. And it definitely is by 100%. I mean, like Russia and Ukraine did nothing to be pulled into this war and to be attacked and be brutalized and to, and all these things and to have all these war crimes committed upon them. Nothing. But ultimately, I think I always focus on the bigger questions. Once this war ends and Russia is losing its power or should lose its power, what next? And how do we make sure that Ukraine never experiences again? The obvious question is NATO, which to me, I think should. I have no problem with Ukraine being a part of NATO. We could talk about those issues, but because I think NATO in one instance is good, at least for Europe, because Eastern Europeans have a very different perception of it. But I also understand NATO's colonial infrastructure as well. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to engaging everybody in this. And I hope that this introduction to who I am and what I do and how I think about this conflict, was helpful.
That's great. Thanks so much, Terell. You can hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, it's like you're in my basement, which is where I am. But no, it's so great that you could join us, and you have such a unique perspective on this, and one that illuminates so many dimensions of the conflict. Of course, people like me sitting in an ivory tower far away, we can analyze and see certain dimensions of it, but you see different things by virtue of being on the ground, by virtue of your particular background, and by virtue of your commitment, which is just incredible. The work that you're doing, you call it the humanitarian work, as if that's just kind of a little side thing.
Yeah.
Sorry about my cat is making a racket, but hopefully you can hear me all right. So we're just really grateful to have you here. What I'm going to do is, my job is to be moderator. There's a bunch of questions that are starting to float in, and I know that you're on the ground. You can talk to your own personal experience best. But you also have this analytic mind where you can talk how you see developments, where you see them heading. So there's going to be some of each kind, some that draw on your personal experience, some that ask you to sort of make sense in a more macro sense of what's going on. But let me start with a quick question, and then I'll start to digest some of the questions from the chat, which I will, to spare you the effort, I'll feed you the questions from the chat, right? Because I know it's hard to monitor things and answer at the same time. But I do want to ask you about some of the claims that we get from the Russian side, which I know what to make of, you know what to make of, but maybe just a little bit of engagement on this about the far right in Ukraine, right? There's some discussion, and every once in a while it bubbles up on Twitter. I'm sure you're aware of it, and about the neo-Nazis who've been incorporated into the Ukrainian armed forces, and that they're playing some kind of a role here. And it plays hugely into Kremlin propaganda, right? About denazification and all of this kind of stuff. Can you put that in perspective? I mean, especially as a person who's, well attuned to the, racism of the far right in maybe multiple countries. Anything you can say on that score? The Azov Battalion, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm looking right now, and Mehdi Hassan, when you had that question, Mehdi Hassan from MSNBC, he just did a long segment on the neo-Nazi groups that are fighting in Ukraine, the Rusich, the RUN, and the RIM. He has multiple neo-Nazi groups that are fighting here in Ukraine right now on behalf of Putin. And to deal directly with your question, yes, does Ukraine have a far-right problem and a neo-Nazi issue here? Yes. So let's just get to the fact. That is an issue. In fact, I'll tell you that it ebbs and flows. And so, just the fact they have no political power, but when they ebb and flow, they have long run with, I think, relative impunity. And I think that was definitely a failure of the Ukrainian government. That part is true. When I first came to Ukraine on my Fulbright, they were some of the first people I saw. And I've had several run-ins with them. Now, I'm not the biggest person on in the world. I'm 6 feet, like 180, whatever. So again, I'm not the Rock, but I have a particular type of posture where I'm not an easy I'm not what would be considered an easy target. You understand what I'm saying? And so basic, I'm not trying to say I'm tough. I'm just trying, talk to you about the mindset of the people who do this. I mean, they're cowards. That's the first thing, right? And they're cowards. And I've had several run-ins with them. And when you stand your ground, they don't fight back. But my point is that, yeah, they are here. And I had one person, I think in 2017, I was waiting from the McDonald's on the Maidan, and this guy said that he was from the Azov Battalion. He was calling me N-word this, N-word that, in English, which I'm like, okay, okay. And so, he was talking to me in English, I fight for Azov, yada, yada, yada. So I was waiting for my Uber. I waited for my Uber patiently, ready. I stood my ground and I went off. So yes, they are there. And they namely attack Roma groups and have killed them. And the Ukrainian government has failed in calling them out and dealing with them. Again, I will also state that anytime I have dealt with racism, particularly during my Fulbright, I went to my embassy and I spoke with the political director. He was so angry and pissed off. He said, for example, even if it was a cop, they were like, who are the cops? We're going to find them. We're going to send our Ukrainian colleagues and deal with them. Again, that's passport privilege. None of that particularly helps me while I'm on the street by myself. But the point of it is that the resources I have to deal with the problem are vastly different from people who come from the continent. And again, incredibly unfair, right? And there's a particular type of racism that's targeted towards, Black people, period, but especially towards people from the continent. And again, I keep bringing this up because I just want to, we have to acknowledge these inequities. That said, the reason why I went, but that said, that roughly when I deal with any, that's pretty much a rare thing. When it happens, it's very bad, at least in my instance. But compared to Russia, it's far worse, right? And it doesn't compare. So it's basically kind of like saying, well, there's anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Well, you can say that, and it's true. But the anti-Semitism in a lot of Western European political parties and actually activity in acts of anti-Semitism are far worse in Western Europe. So the question is, why are we doing this to Ukraine? And so the reason why you hear this Russian propaganda is that Ukraine is the Kremlin's #1 target. And what the Kremlin is always good with is they're very good with taking troops and exaggerating them and positioning themselves as and they use their history, right? Soviet Union of, we are a nation of diverse cultures, even though they colonized all of them, okay? It's not like people in Central Asia were saying, hey, y'all, we're just gonna welcome all your tanks and we're just going to learn Russian and just to hell with our own language and our own culture. We're forget all that. We're just going to welcome you. I mean, yeah, never mind all that. Okay. Ukraine does not have that history. Ukraine does not have the history of essentially liquidating their University of Jewish intelligentsia after the fall of the Tsar. Now, does Ukraine have history of acts, of atrocities against Jews? Yeah. Do they compare to Russia? No, they do not remotely close. So I'll just close out by saying that while the Azov stories are definitely true, you're taking, what Russia is doing is basically pointing to Ukraine, not because they care about anti-Semitism, because here's the thing, the Russians don't care about that. Putin doesn't care about these people. He's using it as a political ploy. And the big irony in all of this is that Russia's anti-Semitism and their Nazism is far worse. So that's my response.
Yeah, I mean, totally with you on that. And if you look at the high-end estimates of the size of the Azov battalion, I mean, we're talking about 2,500 or 3,000 fighters, right? And compared to the size of the Ukrainian, I mean, we're talking 0.5% of the army. So, but
it doesn't compare.
Yeah.
And for all you all need to know, I mean, get your phones and look up the Black 100s. Okay, you know, they and so the Black 100s they were a group, you know, that was incredibly anti-Semitic, anti-Ukrainian, kind of like a semi-religious kind of, you know, it was a movement. It ended at the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So it had to stay, you know, and Edward, I think they had to stay at roughly 60 years or something like that, if I'm not mistaken, that movement, the Black 100s. And so my point of bringing that up is that if you look through Russian history, whether it be the USSR, the Russian Empire, through its various empires, they have a history of anti-Semitism and fascism that makes Ukraine look like paradise. Doesn't compare.
Yeah. I mean, like you've made this point on Twitter as well, and I think it's the right one, which is to say, you can recognize the far right problem as being something that, well, the world has a far right problem, but there are those who have it way worse, and
including America,
including the United States. Exactly. Let me pivot a little bit and ask, because there's some questions coming in. By the way, anyone who has questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll try to get to what we can. You mentioned the not sure you use this word, but sort of the effectiveness of the ground troops, you know, fighting to protect Kyiv, actually Ukraine in general, and we've seen reports about, you know, up to maybe 15,000 Russian troops lost. It seems pretty clear that there's some degree of incompetence, some degree of whatever on the Russian side, but that amounts to Russians losing the ground, or maybe not winning the ground war in ways that they expected to. Mm-hmm. And kind of with that, I think over the past couple of days, we've seen a shift to more aerial assaults, right? Coming from the Black Sea and stuff like that. I mean, you know, a lot of these are kind of unverified reports. It's hard to know what to make of that. And then there's the strike against the carrier in Berdyansk, I think it was. Yeah. So, like, is the nature of the war shifting from ground to air, and if so, sort of what's the significance of that in your estimation?
So that's a good question. So here's the thing: for those of you who don't know, much of what Ukraine is doing, so there are a couple things that's taking part here, right? So Russia has nearly 1 million people who are, you know, like 800,000 or so troops that are on their lists compared to 250,000 in Ukraine, right? But here's the thing. Much of what Ukraine has in regards to its anti-aircraft missiles, their interceptors are from the Soviet period, right? So, you know, when you think about America, you think about the Patriot missile system, you think about all these advanced these NATO advanced technologies that Ukraine does not have. And so the Russians know what the Ukrainians have. What they did, you know, so there are a couple of reasons why the Ukrainians are winning the war. Number one, this is their land and they know it. Number two, I think it goes back to his degradation of Ukrainian people. They're too incompetent, they're too stupid, they're too inferior to beat the Russians. In my mind, I think that's what it is. His racism, his kind of very, you know, his attitude about Ukrainians. If you think low of people, one of the things you think about them is that if they're not smart enough to fight us and win. And if you don't think look at them and grant them agency, you don't think they're going to fight you. So, you know, but okay, so I'm going to give you some technical issues, some technical dynamics. One, the Russians believe that they're going to take this country in 3 days, take Kyiv in 3 days, which is insane. For those of you who don't know how huge Ukraine is, if you look at the American map, it starts from my home of New York City, going into Ohio, and from the south goes down to Virginia. It is a humongous country. Russia would have to literally deploy every last one of their soldiers at once to take this country over, maybe. The Nazis did it and were eventually beaten. One of the first lessons that comes back to a very basic lesson. Occupations tend to fail because the people don't want you there. And we learned that with Afghanistan twice. They don't want you there. And people brought up Chechnya and Aleppo, for example, in Syria. A couple things happened technically. None of those places had the interceptor platforms that Ukraine has. So for every bomb that comes down, for the most part, Ukrainians can intercept them. Now the debris will come down and cause damage, which has happened, but you can intercept that missile. And this is old Soviet technology. That's not modern. That's doing that, which is why I think it's surprising a lot of people. It's been holding up particularly well. And so they've decided to, the Ukrainians have decided to protect key cities, like Ukraine and a few others. And so it's like a calculus, so to speak. When you look at the ground troops, many of them are conscripts. The Ukrainians here, on the other hand, have experienced being deployed and being circulated out into Eastern Ukraine. So they have fighting experience. And Russia, on the other hand, does not have the experience of fighting a war of this scale. The last time they fought a war of this scale was World War II. And you can't count Afghanistan because that was kind of a flat occupation. So they didn't fight a war with this type of adversary, which is what I mean specifically. So you have that. And then the difference between 2014 and 2022 is that Ukraine in 2014 did not have a military, essentially, because the former president, Viktor Yanukovych, made it that way. And we remember one of the, that when he extended the lease for the Russian Navy in Sevastopol, which is one of the reasons why they have a tactical advantage at sea, as they do, right? So, but what's happening is that you have these conscripts, the logistics were terrible. And so there's a saying that amateurs discuss strategy, professionals discuss logistics. And so logistically, when you have a corridor, which is about 60 miles or so, entering a very hostile environment, because this is from a military standpoint, this is a horrible place to fight. If you're an adversary, I mean, it's just horrible because it's urban warfare, which is something that, I don't care if you're whatever type of military you are, you don't want to fight in an urban environment. They're just terrible because your opponents know their land. They know every crook and cranny. And so, but they can't even make it that far because their soldiers, are conscripts who are told that this was an exercise, who did not come to fight, do not want to fight, and don't have the capabilities to fight. The Ukrainians have better skilled soldiers because the Americans trained them, particularly their special forces. And so what's happening is that they're picking apart this corridor, right? And so they're ambushing them, guerrilla style. And the only reason why the vast majority of the Russian soldiers aren't dead here is because there are not enough Ukrainians to kill them. And I know that sounds very graphic, but that's just the truth. When it comes from a skill point and a tactical point, it's bad. And then you also see that there are roughly, I think like 5 or 6 Russian generals who've been killed. Why does that happen? Very easy. That means because the way that Putin has set up his military, he did not set up the military to be competent and independent. And they rely on the FSB, KGB. Why am I saying KGB? They rely on the intelligence services instead of having their own competency in their own chain of command. And so he did, so he essentially purged off all the, the more intelligent officers that would be able to make key decisions. And so what happens is that those generals are going into the field, laying off orders, and the snipers are getting them. And they also are, and so they also are using, communications that are not encrypted. Again, logistics. The soldiers are going hungry. They're running out of gas. They're knocking on doors to these old Ukrainian grandmas, and they're chasing them out of their yards with pitchforks. This is literally happening. If you go to Russian Telegram, you see all of this. I'm not making it up. And so when you go back to your final question, I'm sorry for giving you all these details because I'm kind of into the military element of it. But basically, the reason why it's not that Putin is resorting to missile strikes. He's always doing that. And he's used, according to the Ukrainian military, around 1,100 missiles have been fired here, which is a lot. That's an astronomical number of missiles, right? So what's happening is that he's doing it because he knows that the ground forces are not working and they're weak. And so he just bombs the place. He believes that bombing the place of smithereens will work. It actually isn't. And so they ultimately have morale. And so I walked out, and I'll close out by saying this. When you think about the will of the Ukrainian people, I was walking down the street. I would think this is maybe the third day of the war. And, and I'm kind of speaking in English, talking to people, and for those of you who see me on Twitter, sometimes, I do these kind of man on the street videos. And I was talking about shopping at a store after the war, like during wartime, and talking about, okay, I can't find milk, bread, etc. And so I'm walking and talking about bread. And this Ukrainian person comes up to me and looks into the camera and he says, only Ukraine will win. Only Ukraine will win. F Russians, we will kill everybody. For our land, this is our land. That is the energy of the common person that is here. And so they are the bigger military, and I believe that they will lose from a military standpoint because this is not sustainable because it costs too much money, that which Russia doesn't have. And we can talk about the sanctions in this, but they're going to, but they'll never fully take this country over because of people who interrupted my video conversation and said that.
No, that's yeah, that jives with some of the other reports that we're getting. And when you watch the bombardment of Mariupol, for example, and you think about this as a city that is 80% or by, I think credible estimates, Russian speaking rather than Ukrainian speaking as the primary language. I mean, if you're trying to win the hearts and minds of Ukrainian people, you probably wouldn't attack the most Russophone parts of the country. In fact, so Putin's managing to
Those are people who died in the first
Yes.
war, like the first part of it. I'm sorry, just a brief fact.
Yeah.
And this is something that you can find at the Atlantic Council because my colleagues there did the research. The vast majority of people who died in this war are Russian-speaking people in the East.
Absolutely.
From Dnipro.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's a question about that. And it comes from, it's kind of a mashup of some questions from the chat. You've met with tons of ordinary people. You've been across the country and probably spoken to folks from different walks of life and so on. What's your sense of the willingness of ordinary people to accept some kind of settlement that might involve giving up some territory? Or is that simply no longer an option? I mean, so we're thinking, so Crimea, for example, obviously de facto part of Russia right now, or the Donbass region. And so, my sense, just as somebody, again, thinking about this from far away, is that ship has sailed. There's no chance that essentially the brutality of the war has made any chance of a settlement that would include some kind of ceding of territory, makes that gone. But what's your sense on the ground? Is it similar, or is it different at all? Or is there some variety, right, of the among the people that you talk to?
Generally, people are ready to die to the last person. And they're beyond any of these points. People want the war to end, but there are a couple things. So I don't know if any of you have followed the 2008 presidential election in the United States between Obama and Hillary in the primary, but there is a point where, you know, Obama was killing it on Super Tuesday. And I think a few days before Super Tuesday, because people thought that Hillary was going to win, you know, beat Obama on Super Tuesday. And Hillary said, you know, Obama will make a great VP, right? Super Tuesday came, Obama obliterated her. And he said, and you know, in his own way, he said, you know, kind of snickered and said, why would I be your VP if I'm ahead? So I can just tell you, just based on the information that I am getting and I'm listening to, now here's the thing, Ukrainians are suffering a great deal of humanitarian losses, war crimes, et cetera. That's happening. But the reality of it is that the Ukrainians are winning this war. They are winning when you think about the number of bodies. There are so many Russian bodies that are out scattered across this ground that there are not enough people to collect them all. And one major concern is about, you know, the health element, the public health element of it, because these bodies are rotting. And it's springtime here, and, you know, in certain parts of the country, people are already putting out their harvests and everything. You go across the country, you know, this is the land of wheat. I mean, this country produces much of the world's wheat, right? And farmers are already out putting their stuff out. And so people are bracing for this reality, you know, and so basically, what are you going to do with all these bodies on the ground? Because they're all Russians. And the Ukrainian armed forces proudly goes on their social media and shows you these bodies. You know, their whole thing is, this is our bounty, and it's like pride. We have Russian bodies, and they call Russian bodies fertilizer. That's what they call the fertilizer. And so so to answer your question, when you have that type of mentality, they're not going to give up. Because in their minds, they know if we give up a little bit, you're going to, if we give you an inch, you're going to take 10 miles. And so they have entrenched their heels in for the long term. So they're not giving up. So they're not going to say anything that sees any more territory. I don't see that happening. I'm not seeing any indication of that. What I am seeing is that they may be willing to concede about being a neutral country. That is a possibility. And that makes sense in a way, because just because they're making that neutrality now, that doesn't necessarily mean, A, that the sanctions will stop. Because a goal or a tactic could be, yes, we can recognize, we won't join, we will say, okay, we won't join NATO. But what I think should happen is that the US continues these sanctions. And I know that there's a lot of complications, and people have different feelings about sanctions when you think about Iran, for example, which towards Iran, I think they're a complete BS, and they should be dropped in, you know, in all their forms. That's another conversation. I covered that. I'll talk about that, but just giving you a little kind of teaser there. Sanctions should be dropped against Iran in all ways. But anyway, with Russia, I think it's a different situation. And you basically need to bankrupt them for financing their war machine. That's just the reality of it. And I do think that they will have some type of impact on their population, you know, in their infrastructure, so that Russia will be so weak that the people will get tired of Putin. That's what you hope will happen. Will it happen? Who knows? But I have no, you know, I don't see any scenario in which Zelensky will cede land, because I don't think his people will allow it. Now, what he has been talking about is putting forth referendums. So, which is, I think is very clever. So what he's saying is that, okay, these are very tough decisions. Let's see how the people are going to vote for it. That's very smart, because what he's doing is, as opposed to making a unilateral tough decision, he's going to say, let me see what the people think. Now, here's the thing, and now here's the reason why it's so smart. Elections are free here. It's not like Russia. It's not like the referendum that is in, the BS referendum that's in that was in Crimea. In the case of Ukraine, you don't know what people are going to say. Just as we didn't know whether or not Zelensky was going to be Poroshenko until till it became clear, right, that he did. But that's what's happening right now. And once you put forth a referendum, I think it's less about what Zelensky thinks and more about what Zelensky proposes to the Ukrainian people and how they will respond. And we don't know that until that situation actually happens.
That's great. Lots of, I feel like we could go on for a very long time, but I'm conscious of
I'll
your
take
time.
a few more questions. I can take a few more. I could go a little bit over if you all have the time. I do. I can go over.
Okay. Well, let me. I mean, there are a couple other questions that maybe this will give you a chance to wrap up anything you want to say and see if you can address these two questions. They're different kinds of questions, but throw them out there. One you're starting to get to, and that is the question of sort of how, the broad question of sort of how does this, what are the possible scenarios for how this ends, right? And one concerning thing, especially for people, with all the chatter about World War III and so on, is an escalation on the part of Putin, who, looks increasingly desperate, knows maybe that the sanctions are starting to bite, wonders if there's going to be a palace coup, whatever, maybe the time to strike with chemical, biological weapons, some kind of tactical nuclear. Anyway, it's hard to even think about these things. Even my cat has an opinion on that. So that's the concerning scenario, and maybe you can think. Obviously, there are other kinds of less bloody, less concerning kinds of scenarios. Maybe give you an opportunity to say a few words about the possible end game here. We used to talk about off ramps for Putin. That was probably misguided kind of discussion from the beginning, but certainly not now. Now we're talking about how does this end. The second thing is a little bit different. It goes back to your role as a journalist, and somebody put in the chat, I think, an interesting question, which is to say, and you gave us a teaser. You gave us a bunch of teasers, so we may have to follow up with you at some point. But the teaser was that you don't believe in pure objectivity, and the question was, let me see if I can get it right. Do you think that objectivity in journalism, especially in war reporting, can be harmful? Right. So it's not, is it just not advisable, but that it's actually, that's actually a problem. So in other words, how do you see your role in terms of portraying the events on the ground, and how does that relate to notions of objectivity or taking sides in a situation that's, of course, as wars are, deeply polarized? So anyway, those questions, just kind of wide open.
No, I got you. So the first point in regards to the end game, right? So I don't think Putin has one per se. I think that he's run out of options because, again, when you subjugate people and derogate them so much, you don't think of an end game because they're so inferior that you were supposed to get what you wanted anyway, which is Ukraine. That didn't happen. He wants Ukraine to be a Belarus, and I have to bring up kind of sociology a little bit here in history because, and it reminds me of the way that Putin thinks about Ukraine is how I think Soviets thought about Black people to a certain degree. So I'll give you one example. Langston Hughes wrote a book called I Wonder as I Wander. And, he's for those who don't know who he is, he's a famous, American author. He's a Black author, one of all-time great American writers. And he went to the Soviet Union for a year. He went to Moscow. He was supposed to be the lead writer for a movie called Black and White. And so there's a scenario. So the Soviets wrote up a script that that Langston was supposed to turn into a movie script. And Langston looked at the script and he burst out laughing because basically the way it was worked, the way that he had one scenario in it where the Soviets had a scenario in it where the whole crux of Black and White was that Soviet kind of infiltrators were working, were working with Black people who are oppressed at a plant and getting them to organize and form a union, essentially, right? And so there was a scene where, for whatever reason, like some plant owner, like some old kind of rich white person, was dancing with his black maid in Alabama in 1920. Okay, there is no way on God's green earth that an old rich white man, who probably is still pissed that he had to give up his enslaved people as a result of the Civil War, is going to have a good old jolly time dancing with his black maid under any circumstance, which is what made Langston burst out laughing, right? And so the whole point of it, and you should read the book, I Wonder As I Wonder, the whole crux of it is that the Soviets had a very stereotypical mindset towards black people that made their intelligence services miscalculate them. And so they have, and even though they have a great, intelligence service, one of the things that they lose a lot of is cultural context. And it's something that in many instances they never got right. And I think it's the same situation with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians do not have a political history that has this czarish tradition of this top-down. Ukraine has never had that. Their mentalities are vastly different. They are a completely different, like their mentality, they are, again, when I tell Americans this, they look white to you, but their mentalities are vastly different. They never had a czar until they were colonized. I mean, they had, the Galatia and all these other things, and, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, blah, 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 blah. But again, the whole point of the end game is not, and I'm sorry, I think this context is important. The end game is that there'll be a stalemate politically, and Putin can say, I'll withdraw, and we've completed the objectives of our exercise. He can also, and so another scenario could be the worst thing, which is the tactical nukes, which would be political suicide and actual suicide, because I think that if they use a chemical weapon, NATO would intervene. And I believe that some general or somebody high ranking would stop Putin. That's just my personal belief. I have no evidence of this, but I don't think that every person, they may be kissing Putin's butt, but I think that when it comes to them dying, I think that they will take that risk to take out Putin before their lives end, in one way or the other. But another scenario is that Putin is sanctioned so much to the point where it's just not sustainable for him, to where it's not worth it. And he'll figure out a way to say that they achieved their objectives, even though they lost drastically. And he's going to rely on the fact that his country, the civil society is so suppressed that is going to give the appearance that people are indifferent. The question about media is that when you think about objectivity, I've always told people that objectivity, I've told people that particularly American journalism is the white man's diary. What do I mean by that? In America, objectivity in the American tradition of journalism, objectivity is very emotionless, and it has a very both sides approach. And it's easy to say that there are both sides when you can control the story and the narrative. And in the American history, a milestone of that change came in 2014 with what I call the murder of Mike Brown. When you had in Ferguson, where you had people who took out their cell phones and really took over what it meant by by our constitutional right of being, up to free press. Because what a lot of people don't know is that the freedom of speech amendment in our Constitution does not give anyone a license. Anybody with a cell phone can say that they represent the press. Whereas define the press in America is where you work. Unlike medical doctors, dentists, veterinarians, et cetera, who have licenses, we as journalists don't require it. It's the Constitution that protects us. not some governing board. And so when I think about Ukraine, I think that, I tell people that that I am a particular type of journalist. I'm a rarity. I started off in traditional media, covering city council and public radio, et cetera. But it is your responsibility to curate the news that you consume. I say, hey, go to the AP, go to MSNBC, go to CNN. I am just one part of your media consumption that better helps you to understand what's going on. And that is the response. And so for me, I am a minority, so to speak, in that I think the vast majority of people who are out there being journalists should be the quote unquote, in lack of a better word, objective, or people who don't have the opinion, voicey approach that I have. I am designed for a very particular purpose, but I will say, for the sake of context and the sake of context, I think it's very clear who the abuser is. And I think that media generally have been doing a good job of that. But I think in my mind, I think that it's because, I think in my view, I think since 2014 in America, and I'm speaking in American context, some of the American journalists, is that I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has forced people to redefine what objectivity means. And it's been really moving in other areas of media, including international affairs. A lot of people are not drawing that parallel to how this coverage is taking place in Ukraine from the American media perspective, but I do.
Well, you know what? I mean, it seems like you are purpose-built for making that insight, because I mean, just given the work that you did in the US context, your own background, and then finding yourself in Kyiv, which is a country from your Twitter feed that you seem to have fallen in love with. But you have terrific insights on. We're so grateful. I mean, I know that a lot of these things, I mean, you talk about them so soberly and with such great insight, but on some level it must be traumatic and difficult to talk about it. So we particularly appreciate.
Okay, I want, you mind if I add something to it? So I'm looking outside of my window now, just to let you know what psychological war is I went through what I consider paranoia, and I don't know, I'm not a medical doctor, I don't know the right language to describe it, but basically the explosions were really, they traumatized me so much to the point where I started seeing things I didn't, and I thought I saw Russian troops outside of my window.
Yeah.
And what it was, there were people outside who were outside after curfew. It wasn't Russian troops, but for hours I thought they were. And I took some, I don't see it right now, I took some knife. And I thought, I was so scared, I thought that the Russians were sweeping every building. And I thought in my brain that I was going to defend myself against, some Russian troops with automatic weapons with my little plastic knife. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it was, I mean, that's what I was going. So basically, I lost my appetite and my desire to shower, all those things. Because when you think that you can get hit by a missile, it does that to you. And so the reason why I take my approach is that I want people, I'm talking about Ukraine, I love this country, but I challenge everybody that's listening to me to think, how did the Afghanis feel? How do the Iraqis feel? How do people across the continent of Africa, elsewhere, let's put ourselves in their positions when we think about these consequences of war. Right. So I think I focus on Ukraine, but I challenge people to think broadly, because I want you to think morally about these choices. So just wanted to add that in.
You know what? I mean, of course, I suspected that something, that at some point something's gotta bend, if not break, in the mental health department. It seems like it's impossible to avoid. We're really blessed to have had your insights. personally, I want to keep in touch. I want to get you to Canada at some point. Once this is over, maybe you can do a little tourism in Canada. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in the fall. You know, I'm coming back. So to let everyone know about my schedule, I'm leaving April 1st, going to Warsaw for a weekend. And then I'm flying back home April 4th. And then I fly around the States, and then I go to Central Asia for a month. And while I'm here, I'm gonna see if I can pull up the stuff that I'm doing. But basically, I'm going to Central Asia for a month because I have interesting enough, a fur hat business, a fur hat and a fur scarf business that I'm doing. That's a whole nother subject. But I go to Central Asia. Oh, but here's what I'm doing for Ukraine. So you see this?
Yeah.
So I have a bit. So
what is it?
Yeah, so it's a coat from the Western Carpathian Mountains, and so basically from the Western Carpathian Mountains, and so I'm reselling these. So they're from Western Ukraine, and when I first got here, I bought 10 of these items, and so what I'm doing is I'm reselling them in the United States, and 10% of my proceeds from each sale will go to a Ukrainian charity and support people. So, you know, the whole point of me saying that is that I know I'm just trying to show people that there are non-traditional ways that people can come into this field. You know, but at any rate, I'm coming back to Ukraine June the 21st to take Ukrainian lessons. And I'll be here for the remainder of the year. And I'm starting a newsletter that's based on Ukraine, a whole bunch of other things, but I'll be back in the fall. And so if there's an opportunity to come in the fall, I would be more than honored to actually come to Toronto, because even though I was born and raised in Detroit, I have never been to Toronto.
Oh my God. Oh my God. You were so close. You were so close. No, that's amazing. And, you know, just more evidence that I knew that you couldn't be pigeonholed as a journalist. And you're obviously even, you know, you're not just a journalist or an advocate or a humanitarian worker or an analyst or whatever. You're all these things at the same time, entrepreneur. There's a lot going on there, but we're just, like I said, we're really, really blessed to have had you. And, you know, I guess I should say, like a good Canadian, apologies for making you go through traumatic discussion that might trigger some traumas.
No, I'm fine. I talk about this. It's important. It's important. I chose to be here. And another thing I didn't tell you is that the number one, you know, I'm not here because of political science or anything. I'm here because of my faith. And I'm not saying this in the sense to proselytize. I'm saying it more in the sense that, you know, the disciplines of political science, international affairs, history, and sociology do not have the requisite pedagogies to really flesh out the totality of what is happening in Ukraine. And so I include faith and also theological approaches in my analysis of things, because it goes back to the humanity of people. And I think that theology, theological frameworks play a role in this. And so because of my faith, I am here. So I chose to be here because I feel like I am supposed to be here. But I also talk about it from my faith standpoint, in that I want people to know that it is okay to discuss that. And in fact, I spoke to my therapist twice, last week, to do that in order to deal with what I'm experiencing. And I encourage people to pursue mental health treatment if they can afford it and find resources to help with that. And also, I'm going to speak with my therapist when I return. And I want to normalize us talking about the travails of being in this environment.
Oh, that's great. Another important message. Terell, we're just so grateful that you could take the time, and glad that we finally got the day and hour straight. So, you know, the weird thing about, the great thing about Zoom is that we can have these conversations across space, like it's like you're in the same room. The horrible thing, internet connection didn't break. The horrible thing is that when the conversation ends, we hit the button and then we're done. We can't go out to a coffee or something like that. But nonetheless, hopefully we can do it in person in the fall. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, thanks again on behalf of all the organizers here and the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and the U of T community. We've really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll let you know when it's posted so you can share it in your networks.
I'd absolutely do that. Thank you so much, Nah. It's an honor that you all invited me, and please reach out. I'm on social medias. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, so please reach out. Thank you so much.